Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If this is your first time here, welcome. So glad to have you. And as always, for the regular listeners, thank you so much. I so appreciate you being here and listening. So this is actually the start of a really fun little mini series is what I'm going to call it, because I am heading to France soon. Actually, by the time you're listening to this, I will either be in France or be back from the trip. But this has been a big trip that I have just been wanting to have happen for so long. We'd planned to do it before the pandemic, and of course, that put a little bit of a deterrent on it. So we had to wait a little bit of time, but it is finally happening. And I wanted to take you along with me. So I'm going to do a little French mini series. We're going to learn about French wine. I'm going to talk to you about my trip, but then also educate you on a lot of French wine things and talk a little bit about traveling for wine and going to different wine regions. So today we are starting off with an amazing interview. I am so excited that I got Katie to join us. Katie, if you are on Instagram and you are into wine, you've probably seen her before. She is at French Wine Tutor. And if you have any interest in, getting better at, or at least better pronouncing and understanding some of your favorite French wines, Katie is someone that you need to go follow, and you are going to love this episode. So like I said, Katie is at French Wine Tutor on Instagram. She is an American that has studied French since she was 11 years old, and she's lived in France several times. She started French Wine Tutor, an Instagram handle and a blog, in July of 2019 after realizing that the wine industry overall had a lack of understanding of how the French language worked. The idea was that the more people understood about French wine, the more they'd be interested in drinking it. I'll be talking to Katie about how she got into French, how that connected her into the French wine world, and everything that she's learned along the way. We'll get plenty of tips from Katie about finding great French wine, and then just about learning how to speak it and pronouncing it, and just general tips about French in general, which I think makes this the perfect start to this mini series. And of course, she's going to give us a little crash course on some of the common French wine regions that you might see on the bottle. This interview is going to be split up into 2 episodes. So this is part 1. We're going to be learning about Katie's story, her time in France, discovering wine and language, and really getting this nice background knowledge on French wine and the French language. Then in next week's episode, she'll be sharing her tips for learning French, along with some recommendations for some French wine regions that you may not have heard about or had much and that you should be on the lookout for. There were so many realizations that I had during this episode just about French wine that I never even thought about. So I have a feeling you are going to absolutely love it. Okay, that was way too long of an intro, but can you tell I'm really excited for you to listen to this? Hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for joining and making this work. I really appreciate it. I was really excited to have you on the show for that kind of French wine focus, and I feel like you're such a great person to talk to about that. So before we get into the wine, I want to ask about the French. I mean, what drew you to French? Did you know you'd always have a career that, was in French or was connected in some way, or how did that all work?
Yeah, so French is how I got into wine. The wine came afterward. So I started learning French when I was 11 in the good old American school system. So nothing fancy or special there. My family is not French. We moved around a lot growing up, but I started learning French when I was living with my family in Wisconsin, which actually has quite a strong French influence because of the French fur trappers and the people who we now know as Quebecers. Effectively, we're living in that area, so there were a lot of French classes, a lot of French exposure. The street that I grew up on was actually called Bordeaux Rue, which means Bordeaux Street, which is kind of insane when you look back on
Okay,
it.
wait, I don't want to like interrupt you, but also I didn't know you were from Wisconsin. I am also from
Yeah.
Wisconsin.
Oh, wait, really?
Yes, where are you from
That's
in
so funny.
Wisconsin?
Green Bay, Alloway.
Oh, okay. I'm from
Yeah,
southern Wisconsin, so more just a small town near Madison. But my sister's living up
gotcha.
in, she's in, oh God, I always forget the name of it, but she's close to Green Bay
That's
right
funny.
now as well. But that's crazy. I had no idea. And then I guess that makes sense
Yeah,
because we had like the English and like German influence more so in southern
fascinating.
Wisconsin, but northern, of course, there's a French. Okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just like,
Oh,
what?
no, no, no.
Wait, huh?
It's so funny too, because I feel like Wisconsin is really like a melting pot of all these like European cultures. Like there's a big Polish influence. There's also a big Scandinavian influence. It like really depends on where you are. But like when you look at like the geography of Wisconsin, there's places that are called Eau Claire and there are places that are called Fond du Lac. And like all of these things are right. And so it's kind of just everywhere. So that was when I started first learning French and I just fell in love with the language. And so I never stopped taking French class. We moved around. We left Wisconsin when I was 13, and we actually moved to Florida. So we moved around quite a lot. But my one of the things that was a driving force for me in my education was no matter where I was, there was always going to be French class. So that was a big part of my life, and it kind of became this like second identity because we did move around a lot. So I don't have a like regional, from growing up identity. Oh, I'm 100% from this place, or I'm from that place, or all my friends are here, all my friends are there. I never had that. And so French kind of became that secondary identity for me. So I took it all the way through high school. And then when I got to college, initially I was going to be a vocal performance major. So I was a classical musician growing up for many years. And I went to study abroad at a conservatory in Paris. And it was actually during that time that I fell out of love with music and fell into love with France and French culture in Paris. And so I came back, switched my major, and added on French, really, kept music. Because at that point, it was like end of my junior year, like it was too late for us to be like starting from scratch. So I added French on. And then from that moment, it was very much like, okay, I'm really fluent in French. I'm passionate about this. This has to be a big part of my career and what I'm doing. So every single job that I applied for or looked for after that, I really, really looked for a French connection.
Interesting. That's so cool. I'm curious, before you got into wine, what were some of the jobs that you found that had that French connection?
It's funny. There's not a lot, which you might expect. But my first job using my French was actually working for the International Baccalaureate. So I did customer service translation for their students who were natively French speaking or parents who were natively French speaking who were in Quebec. So there was like a Quebec to English type of relationship there. There's also in DC generally, there's a lot of government jobs and like a lot of government like cultural attaché types of jobs, which is where I lived before I lived in New York City. And so there was a bit of that, but it's government work, right? So like it's not the best paying. It's not like you don't see a trajectory for your career. So I started a graduate school program also with Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They have a French business program where they place you in French businesses abroad. And so I had started that program at a distance while I was living in DC, and they placed me in this internship in Paris, working for a French PR firm. And when I was at that PR firm, I was mostly doing translation, communication. I was doing some social media stuff. And they have a sister agency in New York City that is called Sopexa. And Sopexa is a French marketing agency that is almost exclusively, or at least at the time, was on wine, French wine and food. And so I wanted to be hired by this other agency, but they were like, we don't have any openings right now, but you should reach out to this agency because they might have something for you. And they did. And so that's kind of how it happened for me. I really did not know much about wine until that moment. I had never worked in the wine world. I obviously enjoyed wine on my many trips and occasions of living in France, but I was not an expert or like knew anything about it at all. I just knew in France the wine was good. And so why wouldn't I use my language skills to promote it while I was in the US? So that's kind of how that all came about.
Wow, that's so cool. I always love everybody has such a unique story going into the wine world. There's very few, right? That like there are like, the families that have it, but especially I'm guessing growing up in Wisconsin, the only thing that was on our table, if anything, was some beer or something like
Oh,
that.
right. Yeah.
There
No, we
wasn't a
didn't
lot of
have anything
wine.
at all. Yeah, no. And it's very interesting because my husband is from California. And so his experience growing up with wine is 180 degrees from mine. It's almost like we grew up in different countries because my family did not have wine. We did not have any alcohol at home at all. So for him to be like, oh, it was normal. Like, my mom would have a glass of wine with dinner, whatever. I was like, what? Really? Like, my mom still doesn't drink wine and she knows that like I work in the industry. So it's like, it's just funny how things work.
Gosh, that's crazy. The whole Wisconsin girl and California boy must be a thing. My husband's also from California. I don't know.
Really? Oh my God, that's funny.
Just a quick reminder, if you are not on my mailing list yet, what are you waiting for? I would love for you to join. When you do, you'll get a free shopping guide that has 15 of my favorite wines under $15. Head to corkandfizz.com, scroll down to the bottom, and there'll be a little section where you can join the mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter filled with wine tips, recommendations, special offers, and so much more. Now, let's get back to the show. I love how, like you said, like the French led to the wine. So I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about like kind of what that journey looked like? Like, how did you start getting into the wine and then created and it became such a big part of your life?
I was thrown into it really. I was hired at that agency and I was the first American hire. So everybody else who worked there was French or French Canadian or Haitian or, West African or whatever. It was very cool. And then it was a big Francophone area, company to work for. But almost all their clients that needed social media support, which was at that time my area of expertise, were French wine clients. And it was like my first or second day. The assignment was I had 3 content calendars to get out for 3 different clients in French wine, various French wine regions. There was wines of the Southwest, there was Loire Valley wines, and I think the other one was Beaujolais at the time. And they were like, okay, you have to like write captions and content and pull these photos about and just like go. And I was like, what? Like, I don't know how to do this. So it was very much like a fake it until you make it type of thing. But I thankfully, because those are trade associations or larger regions, there's a lot of educational materials that go into that. And so they did have, books and booklets and, classification, like in these like spiral bound notebooks and notes from other people about the wines they liked. They had like a full cabinet of all these wines that you could look at the labels and you could taste and everything. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm getting started. And so my first like 3 months on the job, I was just teaching myself absolutely everything that I could possibly teach myself about wine. So it was crazy. I don't know how I did it. I don't know if I could do it now. Half the materials were in French, half were in English, half were poorly translated from French into English. Like it was a whole situation, but it was fun and I learned on the go. And then from there, they were like, okay, they mandated that everybody who worked at the agency got their WSET too. So there was a bunch of me and in my cohort who were new to the agency, had no experience in wine, and we all took the WSET 2 together. So that was really when we started actually being academic about what we were doing. But it was great. There's no better, time to learn than when you're thrust upon it and you just
Right.
and then you get into it. So
Yeah, like you had like you're like I know I need to get this done. I can't imagine that though. Like you not only like having to dive into the French wine world in order to create this content, but you had 3 like separate regions that you needed to learn about. And like a lot of French wine starts at like a high level, I feel like for learning about. They assume you know a lot of things about wine already. And so like diving in, it's like, yes, we make these grapes and these are the rules. And you're like, hold on, what's a variety? Like what is all this? Like
yeah.
having that basic knowledge, I can imagine that would be quite a challenge to just dive in and like, yeah, create content that people would want to see and make them want to try the wine. But yes. Well, I want to dive into a little bit more about the French Wine Tutor, the blog and the social media page that you have. And you created that during like when you noticed this lack of understanding of French language in the wine industry. So almost kind of like turning it on its head where like, you knew French first and then learned wine, but now you're like, in the wine industry, they don't seem to have a good understanding of the French language. Can you think back to like specific examples that stood out for you, or what was it that kind of made you come to this realization?
Yeah, there was actually one moment in particular that kind of led to the genesis of French Wine Tutor. And that was that I had Loire Valley wines as a client. And I had this opportunity to take two wine influencers to the region, to the Loire Valley, and do a road trip. And we effectively, me, my client, and these two influencers, one of whom I'm sure you know, Nicole from Grape Chic,
Oh,
was
yes.
really one of the only wine influencers at the time, because this was quite fledgling. This was like, I want to say, I'm dating myself, but it was like 8 years ago or something. And so you had like regular influencers, you had lifestyle influencers, you have food influencers, but the world of wine influencing was not really a thing yet. There was a very small handful of folks in California and New York who were doing it, but it was not the way it is now, where there's, all these great podcasts and all of these great individuals who are, focusing and specializing in these little areas. And it was a very new thing. But they love the idea because most of what the influencers at the time were doing was very educational, which is perfect when you're a trade association because that's what you're trying to do. And so we got clearance to do this Loire Valley Wines road trip where we truly like drove from Nantes all the way to Sancerre, and then took a train back to Paris. So it was very, very immersive and fantastic. And both of them obviously were fabulous, but they didn't speak French. They were Americans. And so I was doing a lot of translation. I was doing a lot of, pronunciation kind of from the winemakers that we were meeting with. A lot of them didn't speak English or didn't know how this worked. And at the end of it all, we were all just hanging out at a cafe in Paris, and they were like, you should really like do this. You should start your own page and like teach other people how the language works, how French wine language is different from American wine language and all these things. And initially I was like, someone else can do this. Like there's a French person who can do that. Like I don't need to do that. Like I'm an American. I'm not even like, some French people would say I'm native speaking. Other people quabble about it, because I wasn't born there. And so I was like, there's no way. Like it would be fun, but I don't know if I'm the right person for that. But the idea like really sat with me for a while. And I was like, you know what? Screw it. Like, I'll just do it. Why not? Like, what is there to lose? It's just a little Instagram page. Like, if it goes nowhere, it goes nowhere. But if it takes off, it takes off. And so for the first, like, I don't know, 6 months or so, I feel like it was mostly influencers who knew me from my full-time job, wine influencers who were like, oh, I should learn something about this. And, we're working together on the partnership side of things too. So I was getting, clients who wanted to work with them and all that. So it was a very small, like, I don't know, 200, 300 people. And then at some point it just like exploded. I think Psalms found my page, and that was kind of how it started happening. I started going to more events and talking to more people about it. And so when the sommelier community found me, they were like, oh my God, like this is the type of content we need. Like there is nobody who's filling this void to like help us on the floor when we're doing our job. And so now the majority of people who follow me work in the restaurant industry and actively use French wine language on a daily basis, which is fantastic. And not initially where I thought it was going to go. I was like, oh, let me just help these other wine influencers, like, get a footing for this language. And then it ended up being this much bigger thing. So, yeah.
I think that's such a great thing to point out that like, and I'm thinking back to like, I haven't done a whole lot of formal education. I did WSET too. And then I've done a lot of training on my own. I think a lot of wine training you can do on your own, but now thinking back to even like, formal wine training, there isn't a lot on pronunciation. There isn't a lot on, and that's the thing. Like I do point it out a lot to folks, a lot of my audience is more kind of newer to the wine world and wanting to learn more about it. And it's like, wine is in a million languages, right? Like it's not expected that you know everything, but it is nice to have somebody like you who is very approachable, and you're not telling people like you're saying it wrong. This is it. You're more like, hey, this is how this is said in French. Like if you want to work on that, or you want to sound, more French when you are saying this and how you pronounce it, it's nice to have that approachable person to then follow and learn from, and then, yeah, be able to say the things more. Cause like, I know I've had this, one of my reels that went viral was one where I said something in French totally wrong because I don't
Oh
know French at
no.
all.
Oh God.
It was,
Oh
I
no.
only know Spanish. I took Spanish for a little bit. So whenever I see another language, I sometimes will try to pronounce it in a Spanish way.
Oh
But this
yeah.
one, I don't even think I did even that. It was the Pouilly Fume, I believe, but I said Polly Fume because it
Oh
had, the two
no. Oh
L's.
no. And did people come after you? Was that
There,
like,
it wasn't bad. Most people were actually finding it entertaining to learn that like this wine about what was in the wine. Like that was the whole point
yeah,
of it. It was to
right.
educate that like Pouilly Fume, that's That's Chardonnay, right? Am I getting
Yeah,
that
yeah,
correct?
yeah.
Okay. And I was
Oh,
trying to
no,
like, I was
no, no,
making,
no. Sorry,
is
I'm
that,
mixing them up. Fouissé is
yes.
Chardonnay and
Okay.
Fouissé
Yes.
is Sauvignon Blanc. Yeah.
Sauvignon Blanc, whichever one I did, I was like explaining that it was this variety, and people were like, "Oh, whoa, I didn't know that," right? Like even just getting
Yeah.
that connection, that
Yeah.
was most of the comments. But there were definitely a few people that were like, "It's pooey," and I was like, "Okay, I'm so sorry, I don't speak French." But that's why it's nice to have somebody to like watch and learn when you want to learn.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because I have also gotten a lot of negative feedback about a lot of people who reply and they say, "Well, it doesn't matter. Like, who cares? This is stupid." And even like notable like sommelier with like big followings, and they're like, "Well, but pronunciation it doesn't matter. Like, who cares about that?" And I'm like, "Well, okay, sure, but for me, I was always interested in other cultures and other languages in general. And so when we look at the wine world and what wine is, it is not just a beverage. It's not just a moment that you're serving to people. It's history, culture, language. It's all of the things effectively that I personally love about humanity. And there's a lot of great things in there. And there's a level of understanding that's unlocked if you take a moment to learn the correct pronunciation or you take a moment to learn some key terms in that winemaker's language. Because if you do book a wine tasting or you do find yourself at an event and you say something correctly or you say a phrase in that language, then that unlocks another moment of human understanding that you might not have had otherwise. And so, sure, in the grand scheme of things, is pronouncing Sauvignon Blanc correct gonna save the world and save the economy from a free fall? Like, probably not, right? But it's a way to open up avenues for human understanding, which for me was the most paramount part of it and the best part about it.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about it. And the first thing I thought of too, and you're like, when people are saying that, I'm like, okay, then don't watch her stuff. Like, if that's not
Right. Like,
interesting to you,
you
like,
don't have
it's
to
not
be
like
here. Yeah.
it's not like you're over there commenting on people's videos. Like, you're not saying it
Yeah.
correct. You should say it like this. Like, you're
Right. No, no, no.
creating content. So, like, if somebody's
Yeah.
not interested in pronunciation, cool, not for you.
Totally. Yeah. Then do it wrong all you want. I'm just giving you a free education. Here is an avenue. If you would like to explore it, you don't have to explore it. It's up to you. So, yeah.
No, it's such a great point. Well, I'm kind of curious too, like in, many ways, I feel like the world of French wine is steeped in this tradition, right? And do you ever think that's a deterrent keeping them away from more potential customers, or because of that, those difficult pronunciations, like it turns people away from the wine, like French wine? This podcast is sponsored by Repour Wine Savers. Listen, I love wine, but that doesn't mean I want to drink a full bottle every night. You see, it's always a risk opening a bottle knowing I'll only have a glass or two. But now I don't worry about that at all because I have Repour. These little contraptions will keep your open bottles of wine good for up to 3 months by removing oxygen from the bottle using fancy chemistry. And they're so easy to use. I simply open a bottle of wine, cork or screw cap, just like normal, and enjoy my glass or two. Then, when I'm ready to call it a night, I rip the foil off my Repour wine saver and place it in the bottle in place of the cork or screw cap, and then stick the bottle in the fridge. Simple as that. Then, whenever I grab another glass from that bottle in the future, I just make sure to put the Repour back on as soon as I'm done pouring. It's that easy. Want to give Repour a try? Head to repour.com, repour.com, and use code CORK and Fizz for 10% off your order. That's Repour, repour.com, and use code CORK and Fizz. No spaces in that, and the and is spelt out. So it's CORKANDFIZZ. Once you have Repour, you'll never have to worry about opening a bottle of wine just for one glass. I mean, heck, now you can try 2 or more wines at the same time and have your own at-home wine tasting. This podcast is sponsored by the Cork Crew Virtual Wine Club. Interested in trying new wines, but not sure where to start? Or maybe you've been listening to this podcast for a while and you love the idea of tasting wine live with me. If that's you, come join my Cork Crew Virtual Wine Club, and you'll get to sip wine with me twice a month while I help you find new favorite wines. The Cork Crew is not your ordinary wine club. This is a community of people who are passionate about exploring new flavors, learning about different wine styles, and having fun along the way. And the best part about this club, purchasing the wine is completely optional. Plus, all events are recorded. and you have access to the full library of recordings as a court crew member, so you can always catch up if you can't make it live. Oh, and did I mention it's virtual, which means you get to do all of this from the comfort of your sofa in your PJs. No need to worry about driving in crappy traffic, finding a designated driver, or spending an arm and a leg on a taxi. Want to give it a try without the commitment? You're in luck. Right now, I'm offering a free class pass to anybody who wants to try out the Court Crew Virtual Wine Tasting Club. With this pass, you'll be able to join a court crew event of your choosing. No strings attached. I don't need your credit card. I don't need you to sign up for anything. You'll be my guest. Simply head to corkandfizz.com/free class pass to get your class pass and be one step closer to becoming a member of the best wine tasting club around, the Court Crew. I can't wait to see you there. Now let's get back to the show.
I think that historically that may have been true, but I do feel like recently it has changed a lot because there's a whole new generation of French winemakers who are either inheriting from their parents or are going out on their own and purchasing plots and making wines the way they want to make it. I mean, if you look at the Vin de France category, you look at the way the organic and biodynamic category has exploded in France in the last few years. When I think back to the most recent wine trip that I had was in Champagne this spring, and almost all the winemakers that I met with were my age, like early 30s, late 20s to early 30s. I mean, then that's remarkable because when you think about like things needing to be accessible, this is a generation that, just like in France, as in the US, grew up with social media, grew up with, free educational resources. And so I think that ultimately it will change, and it has already started to change. But the other part of it that's important to point out is that there are two different cultural sides to wine, American versus French. And a lot of that is linguistic. So when you talk about a lot of people that watched that video of yours did not know that Puy Fumé was Sauvignon Blanc. In France, they might not know that either. That's not something that they know automatically, that Chablis is Chardonnay and, Cabernet Sauvignon is always in Bordeaux, because they don't associate grapes the way that we do with like regions in California. Like when you think Napa, you immediately think, oh my God, Cabernet Sauvignon, right? In France, that's just not the case. They think about the region first, and that's how they learn about wine. And so it's not as much of a like snobby closed off as it is just a different cultural lens of looking at things. And so a lot of times Americans will be like, well, the French are so snobby because they use this grape, but they call it this name, and that doesn't make sense. And they're trying to close us off from it. And it's like, but that's not true at all, because they just think about it in a different way. They're not intentionally trying to be snobby or difficult about it. So
that's so fascinating. And I don't know why that never crossed my mind. Whenever I teach people about French wine, I always make the joke, I'm always like, yes, so Bordeaux is usually a Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot blend, and Burgundy means it's Pinot Noir if it's red, and, all this. And I'm like, oh, they must just teach that in kindergarten in French because everybody seems to, like everybody knows it. But that's such a great way of looking at it, where you're like, no, they don't actually really care about that so much as like, they're like, this is a Burgundy. Like that, they don't care that it's Pinot Noir. Like that isn't a thing that they worry about. It's more like it's regional. Like it's just like, this is the wine from Burgundy. That's what we care about. This is the wine from Chablis. I think that's such a great way to think about it too, because then you don't feel like you're not knowing something or you're dumber than the French wine drinkers or whatnot, because you're just thinking about it a different way. In the US, we think variety first or the grape first rather than, sometimes I think we think about region, but for the most part, like when you look in the grocery store, it's like the Chardonnays, the Pinot Noirs, the Cabernet, even in like wine stores, you find that a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah. In French, they think it's just purely, it's not that they know Burgundy is Chardonnay. They just think this is a Burgundy wine and this is what we're drinking.
Yeah. And there's also a very big difference in terms of the way that you shop for wine in France versus in the US. So like, yes, you can find lots of French wines in grocery stores. And that is a growing way that the French consume and purchase wine. But the biggest way I would say, in my experience, that people purchase wine is they go to their individual wine shop. And when they go into that shop, they rely on the person that works there to truly come up to them and give them a recommendation. Like it's not uncommon for me to immediately walk into a wine shop in Paris and have the person greet me and then ask me what exactly I'm looking for. And I'm not going to say, oh, I want a Chablis or, oh, I want a Chardonnay, whatever. I say, well, I'm having friends over for cheese and charcuterie, and I want a wine that is going to pair with that. So I would say like, I want a wine that's like light, refreshing, like has some fruity notes, or my friends enjoy a wine that's has XYZ qualities. And then the person who works at the wine shop will be like, oh, okay, well, here are the 3 wines that I think would go well with that. And so they rely more on the expertise of the person that's working at the wine shop versus like their own thinking of, oh, well, I like Chardonnay and my friend Sarah also likes Chardonnay. So I'm going to get a Chardonnay, right? So it's a little bit of a different, like, it's about conviviality. It's the moment that you're picking the wine for. It's a bit more involved than maybe just going to the grocery store and looking for XYZ.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and the big thing to point out too, is I think you can have that same experience here in the US as long as you live somewhere
Absolutely.
near a small wine shop. Like, I think
Yeah.
that same kind of mentality, but like, again, like you said, you kind of have to change the way you think about it when you go in. Like, when they're asking you, what are you looking for? Instead of immediately going to like the type of wine you've liked or the thing like that. Like, you could start there. You could say, I like this. What else would you recommend? But you could also just, like you said, explain the situation, explain what you're eating, explain what sounds good in terms of flavors to you at the moment, and then see where it goes and see where they can find you. That is number one tip that I tell people when like getting into wine is like, go find a small wine shop, have them help you find something. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. As I mentioned, this is only part 1. So stay tuned next week for the second part of this interview where Katie gives us a little intro into French pronunciation, talks about lots of fun things that she has going on coming up, and gives us some wine recommendations for things that you might not have seen before, but you should be on the lookout for. If you love this episode as much as I did, I would so appreciate it if you could take a quick second, rate it, leave a review. I think on Spotify you can leave comments now, so if you're listening there, feel free to leave a comment and let me know if there's something cool that you learned. And if you know another wine lover in your life, as always, please share this episode. Would love to get everybody listening to this. Thanks again for listening, and if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And if you're interested in exploring new wines and joining an incredible community of wine lovers, be sure to sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. Head to corkandfizz.com/free class pass to come check out a tasting for free. Cheers!